Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. You're off on this fool's errand yet again, walking through the rugged terrain of Spain towards a church that you could have driven to.
It's not just Spain. We're walking through Portugal also. It's a 2-week, 150-mile trek.
Oh, God, that's even dumber than I thought it would be. If you're walking 150 miles, you have made so many bad decisions. Let's just say the foolishness of the week is already on the table.
In place of our usual front matter, we'll be talking about unintended consequences.
The first one we've got this week is one I think that a lot of people will be surprised to hear because it involves the United States Constitution, slavery, and the slave trade, and how things actually work in practice as opposed to in theory. I think most people are dimly aware that the United States Constitution has something to say about slavery. And as a matter of fact, it has 3 things to say about slavery: the 3/5 Clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the Non-Importation Clause.
Pause for a moment. The 3/5 Clause is interesting. I've encountered a lot of people who seem to misunderstand. They have in their heads that this clause was defining a black person as 3/5 of a white person, and therefore it's a bad thing, when in fact...
They always say 3/5 human.
Right.
And the last time I heard this, believe it or not, was at Duquesne University when I debated somebody from the history department.
You're kidding.
No, and he said that the framers of the Constitution thought that black people were 3/5 human, which is patently absurd. This is a compromise. The slave owners, at the time the Constitution was ratified, would have loved slaves to be counted as 5/5.
Right.
Because then they get lots more representation. The abolitionists at the time, of course, wanted slaves to count as no fifths. So the abolitionists clearly aren't the racists here. Anyway, don't want to talk about that one today. I want to talk about the Non-Importation Clause. Of these 3 things, right, this is the one that was going to be on the horizon faster than much anything else. And what we end up seeing here is that Congress cannot regulate the slave trade until 1808. The year is specified in the Constitution. And I want you to think about that for a second, because this is really yet another compromise. This is telling the slave owners and, in fact, the slave traders that their business was going to be safe from 1787 to 1808.
Right. So when we say that Congress can't regulate, the idea is that Congress can't prevent the importation of slaves.
That's right. Congress can't get all lathered up and say, okay, slavery is now a thing of the past, because the problem of slavery was woven into the Constitution, and the southern states signed on because they got these 3 things. These 3 clauses. So what happens with the Non-Importation Clause? That gets to be the interesting question, because who's president in 1808? Thomas Jefferson, the slave owner. Probably not going to sign anything that Congress sends him on this issue, right? Except that's exactly what he does. Congress bundles up a law outlawing slave importation, not outlawing slavery, but outlawing the practice of bringing people from Africa through various other places to the United States. Jefferson signs right off on it, banning the importation, which everybody, I think, finds a little confusing because everybody knows Jefferson was a slave owner, and yet he did this thing, and he worked with Congress to craft the language on this thing. He knew that 1808 was going to be the time that he could do this, so what happens? January 1st, 1808, he signs off on the law, the very first day it was possible. And what ends up happening? If we look at the slave population in the southern states, it's actually sizable. As of the census of 1790, and given the 3/5 compromise, we had to count the number of slaves, and it was about 700,000.
The population of the U.S. at the time, that was a big chunk of the people here.
Yeah, 4-ish million. But the slave numbers were entirely in the South, and you see this problem as one that's probably insoluble. But by the time we get to 1860, the slaves are almost 4 million. We went from 700,000 or so in 1808 to almost 4 million in 1860. But we know that the slave importation has been stopped. Mm-hmm. And it's probably what I would call the great granddaddy of all unintended consequences. Because if you're a slave owner and all of a sudden nobody can import slaves anymore, you're a slave owner after 1808, you just became a slave breeder. That's the much more profitable business. And you can see how unintended consequences come flying in here. This is probably the worst case unintended consequence that I know of.
We see this sort of thing repeated with unintended consequences, and it's really sad that you have a well-meaning law aimed at something that's egregious, and we say we're going to put an end to this thing, but this law, like any other law, comes with unintended consequences, and the really sad thing is when the unintended consequences actually exacerbate the problem you're trying to address.
As happened here, the problem of slavery by 1860, and we pick that date for a reason, probably utterly insoluble short of war, and of course, the Civil War happens.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. This is the second part of a two-part episode from our live recording at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Last week's episode was our presentation to the audience. This week is the Q&A from that same event. Again, we apologize for the sound quality. Thanks to our generous patrons on patreon.com, we've purchased some better equipment for when we're on the road, which will make future episodes like this somewhat easier on the ear.
We're running low on time, and we want to give you a chance to answer questions.
I think we want to give them time to ask questions.
I'm sorry, yes. You can ask questions, we'll answer them.
We've got a couple of live mics that are going to make the rounds here, so have at it.
A suggestion, let's just cut everybody a check for $10,000.
So it's not cut everybody a check, it's to cut 4 people a check. So you're going to have to draw a line somewhere and say anyone below this line gets the check. And there's all kinds of weirdness that happens at the line, so maybe you want to scale it somehow. Don't let me leave you with the impression that that's a perfect solution. I said it would reduce poverty to 0. In theory, it would reduce poverty to 0. In fact, you're going to have people who say, look, this is a great deal. Well, I wasn't poor before, but I'm going to be now, so I get the check, right? There's going to be that. But when you're dealing with 300 million people, there is no solution that's going to get you to absolute 0. But I guarantee you it would get you much, much closer to 0 than what we have gotten for the same price. And what do you do with people who are mentally ill and they refuse all help? You can write them a check and they throw it away or lose it, whatever. Those are problems that we need to deal with. But notice, they start to fall under a different category than poverty. The root problem there isn't poverty, it's something else. I think what we would find is that as our poverty rate goes down and down, all these other things now become apparent. We realize, wait, this problem over here isn't poverty, it's something else. This one's something else still. And now we can do something more directed to deal with those problems.
And when you think about that, this is essentially the same line of thinking that we would apply to gun violence in the United States. Because if you look at the data, it's a big number every year, people who die in gun violence. And if you dig just a minute underneath that first number, you find that 2/3 of them are suicides.
2/3, yeah.
And, we're all positioned to understand that gun violence is a terrible thing, that we're this crazy place that this happens all the time. I had Iraqis, when I worked in Iraq, come up and say, well, America's very dangerous. I'm like, buddy, we're in Iraq right now. Think it through. And what Ant says, I think, perfectly applies here. When you're looking to curb gun violence deaths, and I have a gun problem, you have a mental health problem. Because 2/3 are suicides. Get on that, because that's something you could solve pretty quickly, I think. Not perfectly, but well enough.
To bring up another war on nouns that I think we're going to see over the next 20, 30 years would be the war on or war of environmentalism. What opinions do you have about the view that governments and the private side should take any collaboration?
We have found, and this is the conclusion we come to in our book, Cooperation and Coercion, which you shall all buy, is that if you look at societies that rely more on government to do various things and societies that rely less on government to do various things, there's a sweet spot. The right answer is not too much government, but it's also not too little government. The The right answer seems to dwell roughly in the space of preventing people from harming each other, but otherwise leaving them alone. And much of the problems that we see under that topic of environmentalism falls under that category of preventing people from harming each other. I don't want factories throwing pollution into the air and into the rivers. This is harming other people. And it's a legitimate use of government. And if you look at the data, it seems to be the case that societies that would use government in that way would indeed achieve better outcomes. Now, there are better and worse ways to do that, right? A horrible way to do it is for the government to decide what factories are going to build or how they're going to build it. A good way to do it, or a better way to do it, is to impose some kind of per pollution tax. That your company emits so much pollution, I'm going to tax you a certain amount for it, and I set the tax at such a level to equal what it would cost to remove that pollution from the environment. And I actually use the tax dollars to do that.
What Ant's talking about here is all well and good, but I'll point out that we've got a problem here, and I'm not competent to solve this problem. But what do you tell developing countries when you say, okay, you can't do this? And they reply, but you did, and now you're wealthy. That's not wrong. So I think we've got this international issue that there's not going to be any cheap, easy answer. And Ant and I, we get into a lot of things. The analysis that we bring to bear on a number of things I think is pretty good. Environmentalism, one of the rare few that we never touch.
Yeah, we rarely talk about it. We're not experts in that, so we tend to avoid it.
That's right. And we also don't comment on healthcare all that much.
But I will tell you this, that at least sticks in my mind as something worth thinking about. And that is, the environmentalists talk today about we should have zero carbon emissions. And I understand all of that and I applaud it. Except that, in part, I can point to the environmentalists as the cause of why we don't have zero emissions. Because in the 1970s, they stood athwart the building of nuclear power plants.
And they still do. They've never taken a backward step.
Now, don't get me wrong. Nuclear power plants come with their own problems. But as an economist, I'm not looking for the perfect solution. The perfect solution doesn't exist. I'm looking for a better solution. And it seems to me, all in, we would have been way better off building nuclear power plants and having zero emissions than what we did do.
An environmentalist yesterday called me a monster.
A monster.
Monster because
well,
I said...
you are, but that's a different...
Yeah, but not for any of the reasons he thought. He was convinced that my support of nuclear energy was somehow akin to killing babies. To hear him say it, this was about where we were. And when you get to that level, there is no such thing as discourse. And when you can't talk about certain things, you can't make anything any better.
I was listening to one of yours where you said the center budget underestimates 25%. It kind of stopped me because I'm just wondering how you can maybe cope with that. I feel like that would be just so defeating.
Well, you're depressing me right now.
I know. I was just depressed when I was listening to progress.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know how you cope with this every day.
It doesn't feel like a war. It feels like I'm swimming upstream in a very deep river.
Yeah.
And no matter what we do, it's not going to make that palpable difference that we want it to make. And yet, we can predict certain things, and we've been doing this for a while. We're now predicting that our system will collapse under its own weight, and it's going to happen soon enough. I think it's going to be terrible when that happens. We're pointing at what happens the day after that collapse comes, because that's the moment that we can have some influence with people who can make a real difference. For a while, we were thought of as those two crazy people who think everything's going to collapse. Now we're known as those two people who might be right that everything's going to collapse. Later, we'll be the two guys who predicted it years ago and we should have listened. But I'm really hoping that after that happens, we can find an audience. You don't need to appeal to everyone to actually make a very significant difference. You just have to appeal to the right people at the right time.
I always have to clean up the mess after James starts to talk about collapse. Let me rephrase this.
Let me rephrase. Come on, man.
Here's what we know. The Social Security Administration estimates that Social Security will be insolvent at some point within the next decade, 7 to 10 years from now. Insolvent meaning there's no money. What happens? Again, Social Security Board Trustees estimates that either they're going to have to raise payroll taxes on all of you by 20% or cut retirees' benefits by 20% or some combination. And you can imagine neither group is interested in either one of those things. So what happens? I think the most likely scenario is that we print the money. what politicians have learned through COVID is that Americans don't mind that much. We may not like it in terms of the inflation that we're feeling, but we seem to like it much better than we like cuts to things that we want and taxes that we don't want to pay. So our guess is that the government's going to fund this insolvency through printing money. And as long as it's doing that, it will continue what it has been doing, which is to at least partially monetize the deficits. And so you're looking at, by our guess, 5 to 10% inflation on an ongoing basis from now on. Now, James used the word collapse. I wouldn't go there. Human beings are amazingly entrepreneurial. In fact, particularly Americans. People used to complain in this country that foreigners are buying up our companies. Back then, it was the 1980s, the Japanese were buying up real estate in New York City and American companies and all of this. To which I responded, countries export the things that they are particularly good at doing. And what are we particularly good at? We're particularly good at entrepreneurship. Now, you can't export entrepreneurship, but you can export the fruits of entrepreneurship. That's companies. So we create companies, we come up with new ideas and new ways of doing things, and we sell them. Buy them all. We'll make more. It's what we do. We'll find solutions to this. I don't know what the solutions are. What I heard you ask is, how can I live my life when it's so empty? The way I really look at that is, we and you who listen to us are in a partnership. We point out the things that we see and how we think the right way to think about finding solutions is, and we don't have the solutions, but we do think we know how to think about finding the solutions. And if we keep saying that to enough of you, some of you are going to have the solution. You'll find it.
Madison, I don't think your life is empty.
No, she thinks my life is empty.
Well, your life is empty. But here's the thing. If I'm right, and I think it's more of a when I'm right kind of thing, and we do get a collapse here, it's very short-lived. Because, and Amp points this out all the time, and I think he's exactly right, the productive capacity of the people of the United States will still be there. It's not like when you look at what happened post-war with Germany and Italy, where they're coming up from the ruins. Yeah, we'll have a monetary system which turns out was somewhat flawed. But it doesn't mean that your life will be all that different after a short period of real difficulty. When the COVID hit and we all got locked in and the supply chains were broken across the country, I'm in Tucson. We have these weird things that happened because we're so far into the desert. It probably doesn't make a lot of sense for that last 100 miles to drive products to us. We're on, right now, a dry run for the end of days. Get used to not being able to find toilet paper. This was always the issue in Tucson. An entire city ran out of toilet paper and meat. You know, a year or two down the road, after we get this convulsion, we're going to be fine.
Let me underline what Jane just said, because it's absolutely right. We'll have the same productive capacity, the same resources, the same people, the same intelligence, the same training, the same technology. Everything is there the day after that was there before. The only difference is our expectations are changed. I was planning on the government sending me a $2,000 check every month for Social Security. Now that's not going to happen. Or I was planning on my dollar being worth the same amount next month as it's worth now. That's not going to happen. We're going to have to adjust to that. And that's going to take a little bit of time. I don't think a lot. But once we make that adjustment, we're right back, only we're somewhere better.
What you guys are describing are really around the role of the free market. So address it in those terms.
We try when we talk to people on both the left and the right. And so we're cautious about using certain words. We almost never say the word capitalism. And even free markets, I'm careful about, because I think whatever solution you all can come up with is going to require that those of you on the left get together with those of you on the right, because each of you has half the solution. You got to start talking to each other. I shy away from using terms that might raise the hackles on either side. But yeah, what we're talking about is free markets. And free market does not, underline, does not mean no government. It means right government. It means government doing the things government should do and not doing the things it shouldn't do. And I think, again, roughly speaking, that line of demarcation lies around prevent people from harming each other, but otherwise leave them alone.
Theoretically, if there was an administration that one goal was like their only incentive was to solve one of these war on nouns. Would they be able to solve it in 4 to 8 years, or is this an issue that requires multiple administrations and a long period of time?
Well, politically, it would be, I think, way too difficult to think that anything of this magnitude can get solved. I don't think you could take care of the war on poverty. I think you've got a better chance with the others just simply because they're smaller. I don't think they're small enough to be all that optimistic, truth be told. And I'm not terribly optimistic that multiple administrations can do it either, because underneath it all, the one thing that you absolutely must do to address these problems is admit that the things we've tried have not worked, and if we keep doing them, we should expect the exact same result, only more expensive. And I don't know that we've got the stick-to-itiveness when you think about how to get these things taken care of. I just don't know if any politician can ever be incentivized enough to do it.
Think as well, whenever we see a problem, when we think about government, we ask the same question I heard you asking, which is, what can the government do? Rarely do we ask the question, what can the government stop doing that's contributing to the problem? Often, there's an answer there. And I give you as an example, we went through some years ago with enacting the Affordable Care Act. It was supposed to make sure that everybody's insured and lower the cost of health insurance. And one of the things the Affordable Care Act was supposed to address was this problem of pre-existing condition. That is, I'm sick, I lose my insurance, and the next insurance company won't insure me because I'm sick, I have a pre-existing condition. And so we have this law that now says that insurance companies can't reject you for having a pre-existing condition. We asked, what can the government do? We didn't ask what the government could stop doing. It turns out that pre-existing condition problem exists because of things government has done. It's actually a problem of government. It isn't a problem of the markets. It came about back in the 1940s when prices were rising and the government stepped in and said, we've got to control prices and we're going to control wages. And we're going to tell the employers, you may not pay your workers more than what you're paying them right now. So what do you do if you're an employer? You've got to hire somebody. The only way to hire them is to offer them more money, but I can't offer them more money because the law says I'm not allowed to. So I tell you what I'll do. I want to hire you. I can't pay you more, but I'll give you health insurance. I use that health insurance to get around that law that said I'm not allowed to raise my wages. And what happened shortly thereafter? Shortly thereafter, Congress says, oh, and by the way, that health insurance your employer is providing for you, that's tax-free. And now, 50 years later, we're in a situation where we get our health insurance through our employers. Now stop and think about that. You don't get your house insurance through an employer. You don't get your car insurance through an employer. You don't get your life insurance through an employer. But you get your health insurance through an employer? It's how the market got around a restriction government placed on it. And now we have the pre-existing condition problem. I get my health insurance through an employer. I get sick. I can't work. I lose my job. And I lose my insurance. And now I can't get new insurance. All this problem caused by something the government was doing. So I think the moral of the story is when you see a problem, you think about government, begin with not what can the government do, but what could the government stop doing that's currently causing the problem.
We looked at the Obama administration and they were telling us all kinds of things. Don't worry, it's going to be fine. I was self-employed for a time. And when I looked to get insurance, I found that if you added the premiums and the deductible, a healthcare plan for me was going to cost $35,000 before the first cent was covered, which meant I can't afford that. And I looked and I said, well, they're going to penalize me on my taxes. The penalty was tiny compared to $35,000. I wasn't happy when I had to pay them $2,000 not to be insured. But this is the result. The more government involvement you get, the more people like me, and I had a weird situation, they just fall right through the cracks. And they started that whole thing by saying, we're going to insure people who keep falling through cracks. Well, it turns out it's whack-a-mole. And every time you knock one down, another one pops up. And I don't think these are evil people. I think they had the finest of motivations. They wanted everybody to do better, but they didn't admit their own incompetence to make that happen.
Thank you all for being here.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.